Okay. Well, good morning, good evening to you all. My name is Daniel Moss. I'm the co-director of the Agroecology Fund. Very, very happy to be with you today. And we have a session today. Welcome to the session on agroecology as a climate solution, grassroots advocacy strategies at COP27 and beyond. And really, extremely timely topic. We're just coming off the heels of COP27 in Egypt and the COP15 biodiversity deliberations in Canada. So I think this is something that has been on all of our minds about how agroecology can contribute as a climate solution. So in this session, we'll hear from grassroots advocates about how they advance agroecology with governments as a climate resilience strategy and how they organize their base members around these topics. The evidence is crystal clear. The industrial food system contributes over a third of global emissions. Without a fundamental restructuring of fossil fuel dependent global trade-based food systems, real climate resilience is unattainable. So we'll hear today from frontline advocacy networks about their experiences at the recent COP27 and COP15 biodiversity deliberations. What did they learn about how to focus attention on the nexus of food and climate? And how does that experience inform future national and international advocacy strategies to connect agroecology and climate resilience? So I want to introduce our speakers. I think I'll just do one at a time, and as we switch to each speaker. But we have a really stellar panel that I think you'll be really happy to interact with, and we'll have time at the end for your questions and comments. So please jot down things that occur to you, and we'll open space after 1 hour's time to engage in a bit more of a dialogue. The first part of this panel will be presentations by our panelists. So our first speaker today is Lim-Li Ching. She's a senior researcher at the Third World Network. The Third World Network is an independent nonprofit international research and advocacy organization involved in bringing about a greater articulation of the needs, aspiration, and rights of the peoples in the global South, and in promoting just, equitable, and ecological development. Li Ching coordinates its biodiversity, biosafety, and sustainable agricultural work. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Agroecology and a Master's in Philosophy and Development Studies. She's a member of a close ally of the Agroecology Fund, which is called the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, otherwise known as IPES Food, and she has contributed to various international publications on sustainable agriculture, including one that was just recently published. And Ching is also importantly an advisor to the Agroecology Fund, for which we're eternally grateful. So let's turn over to Lim-Li Ching to hear from her. Thank you so much, Lim-Li Ching, for your words. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts. I'd like to try to frame the discussion before we hear from those on the ground about how they advance agroecology as a climate resilience strategy. I'd like to start by making 3 points about the relationship between agriculture and climate change. First, we need to be clear about which types of agriculture are contributing to climate change. As Daniel mentioned, the current crises in agriculture, including the contribution of the sector to climate change, are primarily caused by industrial agriculture, which we know is fossil fuel dependent, promotes land use change, and is monoculture focused. The scientific evidence tells us that the world's industrial food systems are the single most important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, more than a third of global anthropogenic emissions. So where do these emissions come from? Industrial cropping, ranching, and land use changes, for example, deforestation, contribute a quarter of emissions. And the remainder comes from processing, transport, retail, etc., associated with the industrial food chain. And we mustn't forget the other potent greenhouse gases. Cropland managed unsustainably is the main anthropogenic source of nitrous oxide, with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer a big culprit. Likewise, large-scale conventional agriculture, mainly livestock and rice monocrops, contributes 36% of global anthropogenic methane emissions. So in sum, the blame can be squarely laid at the feet of industrial agriculture for being a major contributor to climate change. Second, as we all know, there is a close interrelationship between climate change and agriculture. Agricultural emissions contribute to a spiraling climate crisis that in turn affects agriculture adversely. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes this very clear. Agriculture is increasingly vulnerable to climate change impacts, with millions of people exposed to food crisis. Climate change is pushing many staple crops beyond their limits, threatening global harvests. And it's the monocultures of industrial food systems that are more vulnerable to climate change because of their reduced diversity and hence limited capacity to spread risks. But the impacts are inequitable. For example, an overall decline in productivity is predicted, but particularly in the global south, resulting impacts on livelihoods. Or when floods, droughts, and extreme climate events cause sudden losses of food production, these often result in increased malnutrition, but especially so for indigenous peoples, small-scale food producers, and low-income households. Finally, and this circles back to the points about identifying which agriculture is responsible for climate change and how the effects are inequitable. Small-scale, traditional, and biologically diverse forms of agriculture, such as agroecology, have comparatively minimal input to greenhouse gas emissions. But the farmers who practice such agriculture are disproportionately adversely affected by climate change, even though they have done little to cause the crisis. Therefore, prioritizing adaptation and resilience through agroecology is critical for the millions of farmers for whom climate change is already a clear and present danger. But there are also multiple and interlinked crises facing farmers today: food insecurity, biodiversity loss, declining health, etc. And for these problems, we need systemic and holistic solutions, such as agroecology. Agroecology, we know, provides multifunctional benefits, including adaptation, biodiversity protection, maintenance of ecosystem functions, ecological and social resilience, healthy nutrition and diets, and sustainable livelihoods, while at the same time protecting local varieties, seeds, and knowledge, and protecting smallholder farming communities. Now, this underscores the urgent need for climate justice action and transforming food systems away from industrial agriculture towards agroecology. With this in mind, I'd like now to quickly turn to addressing what can be done at the policy engagement levels at the COPs under both the climate and biodiversity treaties. First, we know that the action required to address climate change impacts economic interests to the core, so a lot is at stake. The climate emergency means that we have to stop emitting and start decarbonizing our economies, starting with the global north, which holds historical responsibility for the emissions already in the atmosphere. However, fossil fuel majors and other agribusiness interests are determined to continue with business as usual. For example, the Aim for Sea initiative aims to cluster ongoing projects and entrench an existing industrial logic under the guise of so-called climate-smart agriculture. It's dominated by industrial meat and agrochemical interests and largely tweaks environmentally destructive and fossil fuel practices rather than substantially transforming food systems. Another great escape route corporations have is to deflect attention from the root causes of climate change, i.e. greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore away from the urgent action needed, i.e. to stop using fossil fuels to power our economies and industrial agriculture. How do they do this? By claiming that their emissions can be offset or compensated for by nature, for example, by planting trees or tweaking industrial farming practices to store carbon in plants and the soil. This is the crux of the term nature-based solutions. Of course, this sounds like a good thing, but a closer look at this vague term shows otherwise. Offsets do not actually reduce the overall concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Even worse, carbon offsetting is very risky for indigenous peoples and local communities in the global south, because it is their lands and territories that will be targeted for those offset programs. And this makes such concepts merely a cover for green grabs that undermine people's rights and threaten the land and resources they depend on. So we need to be alert to the greenwashing of harmful industrial agricultural practices. We need to continue confronting corporate agribusiness power, including in multilateral spaces, and to reject the false solutions they peddle. We need to regulate corporations, and this means making polluters pay, regulating and penalizing their extractive industries. Intensive monoculture agriculture is nothing but extractivism and enriching a few at the expense of people, biodiversity, and the climate. And we need to dismantle the subsidies given to industrial agriculture. FAO, UNDP, and UNEP report that almost 90% of the $540 billion in global subsidies given to farmers every year are actually harmful to people and biodiversity. And without reform, this will soar to $1.8 trillion a year by 2030. Secondly, in terms of the action that we need to take at the international spaces, we have to continue giving voice to smallholder farmers, peasants, indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth, and to prioritize the real solutions that they practice and advocate, such as agroecology. We will hear from the other speakers about the work they do on this, so I won't say much more, except to say that to create the spaces needed for agroecology to advance, this has to be done hand in hand with defending the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, peasants and other people working in rural areas. This includes the rights to lands and territories, to resources, to seats, to participation, and access to justice. There has been some progress at the recently concluded CBD COP in Montreal in December last year, but there is much work to be done on these issues. And importantly, there is a continual need to monitor implementation at the national level. And finally, I just wanted to end by saying that in all this, we really need to forward a climate justice and ecological justice agenda in these spaces, to recognize that there is actually a debt owed to indigenous peoples and local communities, to peasants and smallholder farmers, and to developing countries, to those who did the least to cause the climate and biodiversity crises, yet who have been doing the most to steward biodiversity, conserve local seeds and genetic resources, or practice agroecology that is not climate causing. And we need to address this with real action. This starts with acknowledging that wealthy countries, corporations, and elites bear the overwhelming responsibility for global ecological and climate breakdown, and therefore an ecological debt. They owe an ecological debt to the rest of the world. And they must make radical reductions in resource use and restore the atmospheric space that is occupied by their greenhouse gas emissions through the reduction to zero of their emissions and the regeneration of nature. And this, of course, includes dismantling the incentives that lock in industrial agriculture. And finally, they have to put the money, the action where they have to put the money where their mouth is. They need to provide the financial resources to developing countries, to indigenous peoples, to smallholder farmers, to enable a shift from industrial agriculture to agroecology, to adapt to climate change, to foster resilience, and to also pay for loss and damage. The recent establishment of the Loss and Damage Farm at Sharm el-Sheikh is a first step, but action needs to be taken. So with that, I end here and I say thank you very much. Thanks, Daniel. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lim Chi. That was just fantastic for framing all the issues in front of us. Also, giving us a glimpse of, how deep the problem is, and what you mentioned that when you said about the money at the end, to think about that 540 billion or maybe up into the trillions being allocated to agroecology to really pursue a real climate resilient strategy for our food system. So let's keep that in mind as we push hard to push development agencies and governments to really make those kind of necessary investments. And we'd love to hear more maybe in the question period, Ching, about what was it like at the COP sessions? I know you were present at least at the session in Canada. I think where do we see the opportunities to really make advances with governments on this? And I know that there is some optimistic signs out there that people are starting to wake up and listen. On the other hand, there's a lot of vested interests that are keeping things just as they are. So thank you so much for your work and thank you for your words. As I mentioned, Ching was a recent author of a report called the Land Gap Report. And perhaps, you could put a link to that report in the chat as well, and we can share that with the audience. So let me now turn to the next speaker. And the next speaker, I should say that Ching was joining us from the UK. And now we're going to turn over to Togo in Africa. And we're going to hear from Annette Luttah Aluora. She's a project manager at Jeunes Volontaires pour l'Environnement. And as I said, joining us from Togo. The JVE, the Jeunes Volontaires pour l'Environnement, works in 28 African countries. Annette's experience is working with civil society organizations across the fields of climate change, integrated water resource management, sustainable energy, natural resources management, and youth engagement. And Annette's particular interest in agroecology is fueled by the desire to see an end to environmental degradation and more active engagement of young people taking the lead in the restoration of nature and decision-making for community well-being now and in the future. Annette, we thank you in advance for your work as young people to make this transformation towards truly climate resilient food systems. Annette participates in the ongoing Agroecology for Climate Action campaign by the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. The Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, for you, those of you who don't know, AFSA is a continental network, which is we at the Agroecology Fund have been supporting them strongly for the past many years. And she supports AFSA and its members and practices regarding agroecological methods. And she works avidly in her own kitchen garden. Annette earned a degree in environmental planning and management from Kenyatta University in Kenya, and has worked previously with UN agencies. She's based in Lomé, Togo. So thank you, Annette, for your words in advance, and let's turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for the good introduction. I'm really pleased to be here representing Young Volunteers for the Environment. My presentation will basically give a brief on our experiences working with Grassroots for agroecology transition. So I will go through the slides as fast as I can because they are a bit lengthy. So Young Volunteers for the Environment, that's the name in English, has a mission to support young people, to bring them capacity and also build them in terms of leadership. So this enables them to actively contribute to their to development, sustainable development of their communities. Aside from that, we work around energy, climate, and development. We also work around natural resource management and ensure that there is shared decision-making around the use of these resources. And also we work to build citizen engagement for development in their countries. JVE is an organization that is established in Togo, but currently is in 27 countries in Africa and in Belgium, established with national offices in 15 countries. So we're working with young people across Africa, and we're looking to strongly advance beyond that. So Togo is a West African country. It's located between Ghana and Benin. We have around 8.4 million people living in Togo, and our main activities are based around agriculture and mining. So agriculture contributes to around 40% of the GDP of the country, and it employs up to 69% of the population. And as much of Africa, we know that the population is young people, up to 70% of the workforce of the African continent. So Togo is no different. Some of the challenges that I'm glad that Ms. Ching mentioned, the challenges are shared. There's industrial agriculture that is coming up with monocropping, especially when it comes to production of the key cash crops, cocoa and cotton, invasion of GMO species, and this has led to land degradation eviction of the population from some of their cultural lands, increased chemical inputs in the lands, which has generally degraded the soils and the soil health, and also caused biodiversity loss. We also have seed loss, and which is also impacting the communities in terms of loss of culture and their livelihoods. So we could ask ourselves, why agroecology? And here we see this graph that was made by the Nutrition for Resilience. And I like using it because it shows briefly the challenges that are faced when we have communities transitioning to monocropping and the use of chemicals, whereby, as I mentioned, soil degradation happens. We lose species, plant and animal. For example, the pollinators will start dropping in numbers, and that affects the yield in the end. So agroecology promotes carbon sequestration. And we know that with this, it contributes to mitigation and adaptation of climate change, but also protects the diversity of culture in both plant, flora and fauna. Agroecology for us is respect to culture and sovereignty of the people of the country, and also enhances resilience. So a good example is when the COVID pandemic hit, and we were reminded that we cannot survive on imports from other countries, and we have to look for local solutions to be able to cope with the challenges that we have in terms of food production. So in so doing, we would like to promote, and we continue to encourage others to promote local production and consumption as well. And one of my favorites is that we'll put, with the use of agroecology practices, we put an end to some diseases, and including malnutrition, and enhance food security, unlike the stories that those who are against this method of agriculture are busy propagating outside here. So what is agroecology transition? For the case of Togo, we are looking into shifting the food systems and the agricultural models that are used in the country. And for us, we have taken a perspective of using territorial transition, whereby we work with a specific region and thoroughly do sensitization in the region so that we can get the knowledge of the people spread out, and they can know and understand and possess the idea of agroecology as practices that they have already been doing it from years on end, but also introduce new modern methods and technologies that would support this practice. So for us, it's diversification of production systems. It is how to marry plant and animal rearing. It's efficient use of resources with limited or reduced waste. It is how to enhance recycling, resilience of the production systems, but also looking at the social aspect, how to bring people together and conserve culture and sovereignty, which is very important for us. During this presentation, you'll be seeing some photo. I may not address them, but just take note of them because these are the kinds of work and the people that we're working with on the field. So the key milestone for agriculture in Togo, it has been advancing gradually, but I will just mention a few highlights. In 2019, there was a ban imposed on the use of glyphosate products in the country. So this was a great breakthrough because we've been, since earlier that year, we had launched the Agroecology for Climate Action campaign. And this was a big step for the agroecology supporters and actors in the country. And after this, the Minister of Agriculture called out to all the actors to come together and come up with a plan on how we can provide alternative means to farm inputs without the use of glyphosate. And this is the picture that we see on the side. This grouping, supported by the government and other stakeholders, including intergovernmental organizations, started meeting and discussing. And as a result, there was a draft national strategy on organic agriculture that was being elaborated, but because of the intervention of civil society and agroecology actors, we managed to a bit divert the strategy. And now the National Strategy for Development of Agroecology and Organic Agriculture was elaborated. So this, we are still waiting for it to come into effect into the country, but it's a big step for a transition into agroecology. Some strategies that we have used in our campaign has been the mobilization of actors. As key promoters of agroecology practices, we know that we do not possess all the knowledge, but we need other actors and those who have different capacities and knowledge to share in experiences and build a strong alliance that can influence our leaders. We also have done a lot of capacity reinforcement, both of leaders and of communities. We have started territorial support in which we sign contracts and memorandums of agreements with districts and municipalities and support them in developing their local development plans, which takes into account the transition process. So this is a big step. And for us, we've started with focusing in one region. It's a plateau region of Togo, and called the Grand Plateau. So Grand Plateau is basically the food basket of the country, which is very important that they start the transition from there. Policy engagement, we have been participating in national and regional meetings. And because of our vast experience in these policy processes, we found ourselves in a position whereby we can advise the government and also give them pointers on what exactly is happening in the meeting. For example, we followed the pre-COP discussions in which strangely the Togo government was not invited to, and we were one of the few NGOs that was present. And on our return to the country, we had the role of briefing the government on what happened, especially in the Cornivia Joint Work on Agriculture discussions. So that was a privilege for us and a strategic position for us to be. Aside from that, we also support local leaders to participate in these meetings through our accreditation. For years, now going to 20 years, we've been organizing the Agrobioculture Festival, among other events. Why this region? I already mentioned it's a bread basket. It's a region full of culture, and we've been losing the local and indigenous seed. So it's important that at least we support the communities to preserve that. Recently, we were participating in the COP, and we had the opportunity to organize side events. We chased down leaders and had meetings with them with support with the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. We had at least 7 meetings with different leaders from different countries and presented our position in relation to agroecology and our openness to working with them in setting up systems where communities can also transition. And it's interesting to know that part of the outcomes of the COP27 was that consideration of ecosystems-based approaches, which is very good. But then there was a mention of nature-based approaches as well. So we have work into sensitizing and learning and building capacity into knowing exactly what does it mean, these nature-based approaches that have been mentioned in this decision. As part of the lessons, it's very, very important and crucial for us to work hand in hand with the local governments and with the leaders. Because we organized a regional caravan, we had the opportunity to meet with the negotiators. We had the opportunity to work with parliamentarians, especially the Committee on Agriculture and Livestock Production and Environment and Climate Change. And this was very key. If we had involved them earlier, maybe we would have had more impact on how they, on their position. But we still look forward to working more and engaging them in experience exchanges, in all the activities that we're planning, but also in seeing what others are doing in other parts of Africa and the world, so that they know that agroecology is a real solution to climate change. Thank you so much.
Wow, fantastic, Annette. Thank you so much. Yeah, you provided such richness in terms of seeing the various strategies towards the transition to agroecology and all of the richness and sophistication of your continental network, but then zeroing in on the work in Togo. And it sounds like you've made some important progress with influencing policy discussions there. So we are very, very grateful for your work and very proud at the Agroecology Fund to be able to support your work. I think for folks in the audience, I think hopefully you can just see the importance of this kind of movement building that people like Annette are doing with JV and other allied organizations to move this agenda forward. And this agenda towards the transition to agroecology just does not happen without that kind of base level organizing and really sophisticated policy advocacy that really departs from the felt needs of the communities. So thank you so much. So we're now going to move from Togo over to the Pacific, to Papua New Guinea. And we are going to hear from a colleague who is not on this panel with us today because it is very, very late right now in Papua New Guinea, but she has kindly sent us a video about her work there in the Pacific. And let me just share a couple of words with you about Mariara Bang. And Mariara is she's a 20-year-old youth spokesperson from the Dampi clan of the Atsera people of Markham Valley, Papua New Guinea. Mariara is an avid vanilla and cocoa enthusiast who integrates agroecology practices in her farming community. She believes in organic agriculture with a strong focus on protecting the environment. And similar to the experience that Annette described about participating in delegations to influence the conversations at the recent COPs on climate change and biodiversity, Mariara and other youth working with Save PNG, that's the name of the organization she works with, they organized a PNG Youth Climate Symposium to share climate strategies from a youth perspectives that critically empowers young people to contribute meaningfully to adaptation challenges. And I think here it's interesting to see this kind of exchange of knowledge between organizations like Save PNG and JV in Africa, and the kind of importance of global movement building around the transition to agroecology. The key issues that were discussed with Save PNG and policymakers included how environmental stewardship and land conservation, agroecology resilience, and forest regeneration can be useful to developing sustainable models of responsible food economies. And as a result of the meeting, a youth declaration statement was produced and sent to the PNG ministerial delegation, which then subsequently went on to COP27 with the recommendations of the youth. And Save PNG has been able to establish a youth climate alliance for young people to express their concerns and views about climate change in Papua New Guinea. So let's hear from Mariara, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria Buying, and I'll be speaking as a grassroots advocate and youth representative for Save PNG on how grassroots advocates can be able to advance agroecology with the government as a climate resilience strategy from a rural perspective. So we know that the industrial food systems contribute over 1/3 of global emissions, and without the restructuring of fossil fuel and global trade-based food systems, real climate resilience is unattainable. So some of the agroecology practices that we incorporate on the farm that I live on here in the Markham district is we grow crops like vanilla and cocoa, and we also keep poultry. We don't keep cattle, but other people in the Markham district do keep cattle. Some keep pigs. So as you can see, these are some pictures of the vanilla blocks that we grow up here on the farm, and you see that they're grown amongst long lines of Grassroots trees. This is not only beneficial for the crops, the vanilla crops, but it's also very beneficial for the environment. The trees give shade for the vanilla crops, and it helps them to produce the best yield, and it's also highly good for the environment. And over here are some pictures of our cocoa blocks. We have much bigger cocoa blocks, and as you'll see, it's like the vanilla blocks. They're grown, the cocoa trees are grown amongst long lines of Grassroots trees, shade trees, because they give them shade and help them to produce the best possible yield, and it's also beneficial for the environment. So a lot of people in the Markham district, as well as us up here on the farm, we house poultry. It can be, free range chickens, or most of them are kept in houses for income purposes. People sell and market. But either way, the manure is used to enrich the soil, and it can be used for whatever other cash crops they might be growing at the time or producing. So let's say they're watermelons or vegetables or just small gardens in general. The manure is used to enrich the soil. Some people do keep pigs as well, but they don't farm them large scale. It's more like just individually. A lot of people used to keep cattle, but the number of people in the Markham district who farm cattle have decreased in the last decade. So you rarely come across cattle farming here unless it's by industries or companies. For example, one of the biggest agricultural industries in Papua New Guinea farms its cattle in the Maka Valley, the Ramu Agri Industry Limited. They produce Ramu beef, so they keep their cattle, they graze cattle here in the Markham Valley. And yes, it is agroecology based. They farm the cattle in huge blocks of land, and then they shift them around, so it gives time for the manure to enrich the soil, and then for the grass to grow, and then they shift them back again. And then as far as the approach to agriculture has been in the Markham district, it's always been agroecology based, because like I said, we rely heavily on the environment around us in order to be able to give us the best possible yield from our crops. And we can't manipulate the weather and the environment, so the only way you can be able to farm is by farming in a way that least harms the environment. And even though large-scale farming or mass farming isn't practiced widely in Papua New Guinea yet, I feel like it's something that the government should really look into. they should be able to create the ability for mass farming or farmers in Papua New Guinea or to produce agricultural produce in PNG on a large scale that's in a way that it's also climate resilient. Because we have the land available, we're situated in the tropics. So when it comes down to growing food or producing food, it's really not rocket science. And there's so many other crops that have the potential to be produced. But I feel like a lot of local agricultural producers and farmers and grassroots people lack the funds for it. So grassroots people especially need to be educated more on how they can be able to advance in their agroecology practices, but also be given the ability and the opportunity to be able to produce on a larger scale, and the funds to be able to do that. So the government or international donors should be able to go into partnership with local farmers and be able to fund them with their small projects or whatever it is, agricultural crops that they are planting, and be able to give them the opportunity to produce more as well as producing in a way that least harms the environment, because that's already something that people practice here. And recently there was a deal signed between PNG and a Dubai-based company called Blue Carbon that supports carbon removal projects across the world. It was launched in October. And under the deal signed, it stated that Blue Carbon will carry out research activities and develop initiatives for development of carbon emission reduction projects in the forestry sector in PNG. Which is really good because forestry, again, like agriculture, is one of the very neglected sectors in PNG. So finding a way in which you could be able to incorporate agriculture and forestry in PNG or have it practiced across PNG would also be very good as a climate resilience strategy, because you're able to produce agriculture and also have the least possible impact on the environment as possible. And I feel like PNG is already situated in a situation where carrying that out would be easier compared to a lot of other places. So that's something that the government really needs to look into in terms of agriculture in PNG, because in terms of advancing agroecology here, Papua New Guineans farm like that naturally. So I feel like what the government needs to do is work in partnership with grassroots people in rural areas and help them increase their produce or be able to farm more whilst practicing agroecology, continuing to practice it. Large scale, individually, doesn't matter. This will encourage a lot more people to farm, and by incorporating more agroecology practices, it helps sustain the environment and also gives people the ability, the capacity to be able to produce as much as they can be able to produce with the best possible results. And this should be something that should be encouraged to be practiced all across the country. And this should be something that should be encouraged to be practiced all across the country. More grassroots people need to be educated on it. They need to be made aware of it. They need to be taught how to farm like this. Because they already farm like this, but they should be able to, be given the opportunity to increase their knowledge on how they can practice agroecology more and be able to sustain the environment around them, as well as get the best possible results in their produce. So it's about time that the government should start really looking into these very neglected sectors in this country and start developing them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mariara, from far away. We're grateful to you. And please, folks, she won't be able to be present for the question and answer, but if you do have any questions or comments, we can certainly pass them on. Fascinating experience, really great work to see the youth so closely involved, both as farmers and as advocates. And it's interesting to hear about the various programs there, and kind of raises this question again that Ching spoke about at the beginning, about real solutions and false solutions. And it'd be interesting to explore a little bit more with Mariara and Save PNG about these kind of engagements with other corporations from other parts of the world, about carbon capture, et cetera. What really works and what is leading us down the wrong path. So maybe we'll explore that a little bit more in Ching's final comments. We're now going to turn over to the final speaker, who is Chengeto Sandra Muzira. She's a young farmer based in Mutoko, Zimbabwe. She practices agroecology in small grain production, horticulture, and small livestock. She's a member of the Zimbabwe Smallholder Organic Farmers Forum, which is part of the Via Campesina. She is part of the Via Campesina Youth International Coordinating Committee, representing the African continent, as well as being the founder of the Six Girls Club. Please tell us about that, Chengeto. Chengeto holds a diploma in agroecology and has been part of the struggle for agroecology policy to be recognized in Zimbabwe. She's also participated in international forums on climate, women, and youth issues, and she is passionate about learning new things and empowering and helping others. So thank you so much in advance, Chengeto, for your words. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to the speakers for their very insightful and sharing their experiences. I think a few things come to mind. And firstly, I think I'm very encouraged to hear about the experiences of smallholder farmers and producers in the global south. We heard from the PNG. There are so many solutions on the ground that people are doing, that farmers are practicing. And the thing is that has happened so far is that a lot of this has happened without the kind of structural support or institutional support from governments, and much less the financial resources. So despite the lack of attention to these agroecological approaches, many farmers, NGOs, youth groups around the world are acting and are taking action. So that is encouraging. But just think about what we could do if we could actually direct financial resources to these projects and programs and actions from local people on the ground. I think that's really food for thought for all of us. The second reflection I have is that reflecting on all the different aspects by which we can create change. Really, of course, it's quite simple. It's that we know we have to work at all levels, at the local level, at the grassroots level, at the national level, at the international level. So my organization, we work very much at the international level to try and create that policy space for governments and for peoples to be able to take action at the national and local levels. And we think that dialogue is so important, and that what we need to do is really to work in different strategies from the inside, the outside, and to really push the boundaries and start to move the conversation. When I think back more than 10 years ago, when we started first, when agroecology first started to come on the international agenda with the IAA STD, and that was like, it was the first time we got that international acknowledgement about the benefits of agroecology, and think where we've come so far in the last 10 years. But it's taken a lot of concerted effort from groups from all over the world to really open the space for agroecology, or as the former FAO DG put it, to open that window in what was once the cathedral of the Green Revolution, i.e. the FAO. So change is possible, and I'm encouraged by that. And my final reflection is that really we do need to address the structural root causes of climate change, of biodiversity loss, and the ecological and climate breakdown that we're seeing. Because these are systemic issues that we need to address. And all this occurs in, of course, this wider context of unfair trade rules, of unfair financial arrangements between debtor countries that are in debt, for example, that have already their hands tied. Many developing countries are not able to put resources into agroecology because they are already drowning in debt, especially post the pandemic. So we do need to start to address the systemic issues. And I'm also encouraged that agroecology, we know, is a multifunctional approach. It's a holistic approach that can address many of the challenges that we are facing, that small farmers are facing in the world today. So actually, I think there's a lot of encouragement and hope to be drawn from this session. So yeah, those are my initial reflections. Thank you, Daniel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ching. Let me just read, if I may, a few of the questions that have been coming up from you in the audience, and please continue to populate the mechanism, the box there with your own questions and comments. But let me read them through, and there are some specific questions directed at some of the speakers here, and I'll just let you know, and then we can have another short go around. And if Chengeto manages to reconnect, we'll hear from her. But we're having some difficulty, as I mentioned before. So I'll just read these. So we heard from Phil, who asked a question about how much effort do we need to put into making sure farmers can learn from others in their local languages, not just the language of the city or perhaps the colonial language. So we kind of tagged that for Ching, if you have any, but any of you in this amongst the speakers that have any insight about the great diversity of languages and how we can work with those languages to further the diversity of agroecology. Then there's a question here from Normor, which is about how youth can benefit from the Agroecology Fund. I can say a couple of words about that, but also it says, do you offer opportunities for scholarships for learners who wish to study agroecology? And maybe Annette, if you have a moment to comment about how youth can get more engaged in your work, that would be great. We have a question from Diana about how is it possible also for young people to get access to land to develop new projects and agroecology. Critical point there. We have a question from Stephanie for Annette about how did you manage to convince Togo's pesticide regulators to ban glyphosate and address concerns about weed control, especially labor needs for manual weeding? Great question, important. There's obviously a lot of political and economic power of the inputs industry. How did you deal with that? And also, yeah, concerns about the perpetual refrain that we hear about, oh, it's just too labor intensive to work agroecologically. And finally, it's a question really for Mariara, but I think we can all address it. In the West, we have been very used to relying on imported food. There will be some, but not all, in the global South that have benefited financially from that. Should we import or not? Does more land need to be dedicated to feeding people in their own countries? And I think here we had some really helpful comments from Ching just now about sort of the broad political economic context in which this work is taking place. So anybody can take a stab at that. So if you, I don't really know how this mechanism works, but any of the speakers that would like to address any of those points, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll go first since the first question was directed at me. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Phil, for your question. I think, yeah, absolutely critical, of course, because agroecology is really so much based on the principle of the co-creation of knowledge and the recognition that knowledge about farming systems rests with indigenous peoples, rests with smallholder farmers. And, experience has shown time and time again that it's that exchange among farmers, between farmers, that has been really important to be able to share those knowledges and experiences. And of course, farmers don't speak in the language of the city. And there's so much cultural and language diversity that we need to celebrate. And I think it's absolutely important that we do translate some of what's happening at the international level, for example, and the policy wonky speech into real lived examples and experiences and knowledge of farmers. And no, I think it's also about converting our mindsets to say that actually it's not the experts who, the so-called experts who have the answers, but really it's farmers who do. So that's really my response to that first question. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Annette, oh great, thank you. I was going to ask if you might contribute a few words.
Yes, pretty interesting questions that we have here. And I actually thought the first question was best that you answer it, Danielle. How can young people benefit from Agroecology Fund? Well, in our experience, currently we're implementing a project on youth leadership in transition of local food systems to agroecology. And this is with the support of Agroecology Fund, which has enabled us to open a whole sort of interesting opportunities for young people who have great interest in contributing to agriculture. And especially when they learn that we're not only talking about the hard labor work that you go to do in the field, but agroecology is very comprehensive, multifaceted, and diverse. So there are diverse opportunities present to contribute for our young people. JVE established a learning center. We call it the Center for Studies and Training in Agroecology. And through this learning centers, we have managed to plant other small centers where young people can come to learn about culture, about the practice, those who want to have a feel of the practical engagement and gain the skills of how to do production using agroecological practices. They can come and learn. And as an organization that is present in several countries, we are also open to receiving volunteers from across the region and internationally who can also come and share their experiences with us. So we don't offer scholarships, unfortunately. Our small budget will not allow us to do that. But we hope that, even without scholarship, those who are interested from other regions can come and learn and teach us also something from their own side. For the second question, I think about land access, it's a pretty sensitive issue in Africa generally. Having young people access land, first of all, not many young people have that financial power to buy and purchase land at will. And they are often excluded from access of land due to economic and cultural constraints. There's increased land fragmentation these last days, and it's almost becoming very challenging and discriminatory, if I can say that also, towards young people. So there's a need to enhance partnership, and in enhancing partnership, coordination, and synergies from different stakeholders who can also have a positive influence towards the communities, but also towards this group of young people who, because of these challenges, would opt to migrate to urban centers in search of white-collar jobs and would want to stay all day in an office than do, create an enterprise of fabrication of transformation of local food, for example, go into marketing of local produce that is produced through agroecological means, and so on. So these stakeholders can also facilitate to mainstream the youth's land rights and components in agricultural value chains and land governance programs to foster positive effects and empower the young people. And then we also have intergenerational exchanges that we can also capitalize on to sensitize our communities. And the last very interesting question is how we manage to, sorry, you wanted to say something?
I think that we need to, let's continue that in this next sort of phase. As I understand it, we need to allow the audience to depart if they wish to, but to continue to join us and to continue this discussion. The OFRC people can instruct us how to do this, but we'll take a small pause for 30 seconds, join us, and then we can have more direct interaction between the speakers and the audience. But just a quick word to say a huge thanks to Annette, to Ching, to Chengeto in her absence, and to Mariara in her absence as well, and to the OFRC organizers for this tremendous platform. So please hang on, please tune in. We'll start right off with Annette speaking further, and then I can also address the question about the Agroecology Fund. Thank you.